I mean, I think if I hear the word tick box exercise or those three words anymore, it's quite maddening.
We haven't told a compelling enough story about why diversity is important. It's not just about being woke or whatever. Diverse teams are the best teams, and actually diversity is good for all of us.
Do you know, the number one thing I think that will change most people's view of diversity is building better relationships with people who aren't like you. And I think there's no substitute for your own lived experience and enriching that.
Welcome to the CommsCast with Jersey Road. My name is Gareth Russell. I'm the Managing Director at Jersey Road PR. And today we're going to be talking about diversity in comms and how white are our comms. I've got two guests with me today. I'm delighted to have Chine McDonald. Hi, Chine.
Hello.
How are you?
Great, good to be here.
Good, thank you. And Genelle Aldred as well. Nice to have you with us.
Nice to be here.
Yeah. Chine, tell us a little bit about your history, your kind of career path, and how you've got to where you are today.
Yeah, so I had wanted to be a journalist from a very young age, spent a lot of time getting placements, work experience in newspapers and magazines, but then my degree was in theology, and then I wanted to work basically at the intersection of religion, media, politics and public life. But before that, worked in communications roles, in charities, in the public sector, faith-based charities. And I'm currently director of the religion and society think tank Theos. But before that, I ran public engagement at Christian Aid, including their media, PR, fundraising, comms teams. So yeah, we've worked in the comms side of charities.
And you've written a book as well, haven't you?
I've written a book called God is Not a White Man and Other Revelations, which explores racism in the church and in wider society. Yeah.
Great, that's great. And Genelle, you've got a bit of a journalistic background as well, don't you? Tell us a little bit about your history.
Yeah, so I'm a journalist by trade, as I always say. I don't think you ever kind of stop being a journalist once you've been one. But 15 years I was working at the BBC, ITV, ITN as a newsreader, as a producer, behind the scenes, working on documentary and news. Now I've kind of moved away from that and done a few different things. So I've worked in a charity as head of digital strategy, ran TBN UK for a time, and now I've gone into comms proper. So I'm bit of a comms trainer, so that's what I do. I train people, CEOs, businesses, charities, think about their comms in all aspects: presentation, diversity and inclusion, a bit of strategy, personal branding, all of those things. So I've made that transition. I'm also deputy chair of Women in Journalism, so I still do that. So that's why I keep my hand in, and I do a bit of newspaper reviewing for Sky News and BBC Radio London, and a bit of social and political commentary. So nice and diverse. Never.
Do you have any time off?
Mm-hmm. Do you know what? I feel like I'm always watching Netflix. But people apparently tell me I always seem like I'm busy. But no, I feel like I play a lot of golf.
Oh, really?
I play a lot of golf. So
what's your handicap?
Oh, gosh, now you're asking. It's currently 31. But by the time of this podcast, hopefully it'll be lower.
That's
I want to
good.
get a 2 in front of my number.
Yeah, as long as you can hit the ball. I think that's better than I can do. We're talking about quite a meaty subject today, and we're not going to be able to get into all the detail of it, but representation obviously is incredibly important. It's incredibly important in comms, but comms has that impact on wider society and how wider society sees diversity, sees representation. This is maybe an obvious question, but tell me a little bit, Chine, about why you particularly are passionate about this area, because it's obviously dominated quite a lot of your thinking and a lot of your outputs in terms of the book and in terms of some of the stuff you've done in the charities. But tell us why you're particularly passionate about it.
So one of the reasons why I think diversity is particularly important within communications is because actually it's often communications teams, the PR teams that are telling the stories of whatever organisations that they're working for, and actually they are in many ways the front line towards kind of communicating diversity, communicating those different stories, and thinking about what the product or the mission, the vision of that organisation look like. So I think it's really important that we have diversity within those teams in order to get the best out of their outputs, their comms and their communications.
Yeah, great. Genelle, as a former journalist, I mean, as journalists, you receive a few pitches. We are a PR agency, and we're spamming the journalists' inbox on a daily basis. We're not really. We're very good at what we do. But What have you seen in some of those pitches that you received as a journalist? What have you seen in terms of the narratives that are kind of displaying maybe some of those narrow narratives and lack of understanding when it comes to some of this diversity and representation?
I mean, I think you can immediately see when a team doesn't have diversity. And the biggest thing is when people are responding to something. So if there's some kind of trouble or, I don't know, a big social thing that people feel they need to give a response to, when you see that response, I could probably tell you straight away whether anyone in that team actually understands the issue properly and whether or not there is a nuanced and complex view of what that issue is and the angles they're coming at it from. So what you can tend to find is when there's something especially around race, let's take, for example, summer of 2020, George Floyd, people, organisations start responding. And you can see from the response, those ones where someone who's black probably has had a bit of an input in the way that they're responding, and where there's not, because where there's not, there's no complexity around the issue. There's not a lot of reflection, because actually there's no one there actually to reflect on what's been going on and what that has been and meant to people for decades and decades and centuries. And so in that response, it will be shallow,
right,
because the level of knowledge, we're going, 6 inches deep rather than 6 foot under. And so it's terms of having that kind of, well, we should say something because everyone's saying something. So we need to respond. But actually the response itself often doesn't hold much weight. It doesn't carry much integrity. It doesn't carry much depth. And I think that's when you can see that a team is probably not that diverse.
And maybe just on the flip side, it might just be that it's the opposite of what you've just said. But is there pitches or approaches that you've seen that have actually modelled it quite well and that have done this in a good way?
Yeah, because I think it's the thoughtfulness that goes into it. So, I was part of a response to a statement about something, and it was something to do with, I can't even remember what it was to do with. But when I saw the first response, I was like, oh, I don't think this really says what we need to say, because actually we need to reflect that we as an organisation probably haven't paid as much attention to this issue as we should have through the years. And we're actually joining this bandwagon late. So the response needs to include, we recognise that we ourselves have not taken this issue always the way we should have. And so as we're responding to this, we're also reflecting on what we can do differently. And the wording and that thoughtfulness can only come when people have actually lived experience of the thing that we're speaking into, rather than our hearts are breaking, which is all about us and how we are feeling, not about the situation that has occurred. And I think when I'm in those rooms and we're having those conversations and these things start happening, I'm always saying, well, actually, I think as an organisation, we also need to reflect. And that then comes through the comms. But when people are just reacting, there's not often a lot of reflection. So done well, it's the thoughtfulness.
Yeah, okay. You go on, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to that I guess with George Floyd in 2020, I was really in an interesting position because I was working for a big international development agency that had a black woman CEO. I was leading the comms, right? So obviously we are going to be able to respond to what's happening in 2020 very differently to many of the other UK faith-based NGOs who didn't have that diversity already, who didn't have people within their staff teams who have lived with this kind of racism our whole lives, who had for 50, 60 years talked about racism and black people being in poverty around the world for all of those decades. So I guess in some ways, I'm just thinking about it, that we were in an advantage at that particular point in history. So we weren't kind of scrabbling around for kind of black voices and finding none, because there were lots of us within the organisation, including the person at the top. So that's partly why it's really important to think about diversity before you're at a crisis point like George Floyd's murder. Not just it being about what it looks like when it happens, but actually you will already have naturally talked about these issues and held them as important. So therefore your response, whatever you say in your communications, is much more authentic because it's coming from that real lived experience.
And it's beyond just a crisis as well, isn't it? It's beyond just when bad things happen to black people. The diversity of thought is important in comms generally, right? In terms of the depth and texture of how we communicate.
Yeah, it's really important to think about all types of diversity. And sometimes I think we think, okay, we've got one black person in the media team, so we're good. But actually, we need to think about diversity of class, of gender, of physical ability and disabilities. There's all sorts of different ways. So the job's never done on diversity. So again, it's really important that diversity comes from both the kind of lived experience, but also diversity of background, because that helps to sharpen whatever you put out into the world. And it's not just about race, but race is such an important thing. And it's a visible diversity, but there's also diversity of thought and background and class and wealth and all those things as well.
Yeah. Janelle, I'm assuming, and this is an assumption, that you've often been the only black woman or black person in the room, in the newsroom, or wherever it might be at any given time. What challenges have you faced when trying to bring that more holistic approach to communications or understanding of the story? What challenges have you faced personally in that?
I mean, I think if I hear the word tick box exercise or those 3 words anymore, it's quite maddening. As I said to one person, they were like, we need to get a diverse person in the things for, the tick box exercise. And I said, it's not ticking a box, it's actually reflecting the audience back to itself. And I think there is that misunderstanding that we're kind of doing it for some tokenistic thing that's only good for the person we're doing it for. When the reality is it's actually about us reflecting the audience back to itself. If your audience is everything, but your team are one thing, that means actually you can't communicate well with your audience, because you can communicate with them through one lens, through one aspect. And I think when it comes to diversity of thought, yes, people say, well, no one thinks the same. True. So you get 10 white men in a room, they're not all going to think the same. There is going to be a diversity of thought, diversity of background, but there's not enough difference. And when we add in gender, when we add in class, when we add in race, when we add in cultural differences, what we're getting is more difference. And the more difference you have is just the more accurately you can reflect back the kaleidoscope of an audience that you have, because there's no one person that can understand every experience. I cannot speak for all black women because we've lived very different experiences, just life, family, parents, upbringing, schools I went to, cities I lived in, the media I consume, all the things that go on underneath the surface that you can't see from looking at me. That's what makes me a unique individual. So me and Chine, we've got very different experiences. So no one can say, well, Chine says that that's fine. So it's okay for us to say this because she says it's okay. But actually, okay, well, what if I say it's not okay? And I think it's about allowing all different cultures to have complexity, because no one would expect that you and your colleagues are all going to have the same view on something. So thinking that maybe black people will is kind of making us like a flat monolith, and not also allowing us the diversity of thought within our own community about the way to deal with things. And so for me, one of the challenges has always been, we've got someone else who doesn't see it that way. Okay, well, I see it that way. So what now? It's kind of allowing the diverse people in your team to also go through the layers of complexity, not just from the characteristic of being a woman or a black person or working class, and allowing them to have that complex nuance that brings something really rich if we'll let people bring it.
And I think that's what's important, isn't it? Because some people might be paralyzed by that because there's so many different opinions that it's like, well, do we just say nothing then? But actually it's about purifying the message or honing the message so that we get to a point where it's never going to please everyone and it's never going to engage with everyone. But charities particularly, well, maybe not particularly, but certainly in the world that we live in, charities often spend time doing persona work, insights work, trying to understand who their audiences are, but then the messaging doesn't always fit with that. So it's about what's right for the audience you're trying to speak to and what's not right at the end of the day, and being effective communicators. How have you found that particularly in the charity sector stuff that you've been doing? How have you gone through that process that Janelle's talking about, and then come to a point where you're kind of comfortable with the message that you're delivering through the communication channels?
Yeah, I would say that it is a real challenge being the token, not the token, but the only, and also wanting people to recognise that there is diversity within my ethnicity or my kind of background. So I guess where I've got to is that I don't represent all black women, but I represent at least a black woman who is in this conversation. So there have been times when I've had to kind of, sign off communications things or reports, whatever it is, where I've been like, okay, every person that we spoke to in this was a white person. Probably like 95% of them were white men. And I know that clearly other people haven't been thinking that that's a problem. So at least I will always have that kind of radar on, because I'm looking for diversity as a comms professional, because I think not only is it a problem to not have that diversity, but it represents a lack of having thought these things through, which in this day and age just doesn't cut it. So if I see an organisation or a board or whatever that has only white men, then I'm like, this is probably not the place for me, because they haven't already thought about these things, or they don't think it's important to represent diversity in some way. So yeah, where I've got to is I think I try and bring a black voice, a woman's voice, if there are women missing. But once we have at least kind of a black person or a woman represented, then we can talk about, okay, well, what do two black women think who might have different views? But actually, you've got to start somewhere. But it is really difficult, I think. I mean, it's a challenge trying to do both of those things. Like, say, please recognise that I'm a black woman, but recognise that I'm not all black women.
Yeah, and you're not just a black woman either.
Yeah.
One of the challenges, Genelle, that a lot of Christian charities face is that they have an aging donor base. So whenever clients come to us and say we want to engage with a younger audience, they usually mean 50 or 60-year-olds rather than 20 or 30-year-olds. How much of that do you think is because the tone and content of the messaging has been directed at those audiences, and how can Christian charities or charities in general change that in order to engage different audiences?
Yeah, I think, you get you get who you're talking to. So if you're talking to a specific group, then yeah, they're the people that flock to you. I think a lot of charities, and it's not just charity, a lot of people, they employ young people, they employ diverse people, they try to be inclusive, and they don't listen to them when they do join. So when people are sticking their hand up and saying, hey, maybe actually we shouldn't say it like this, maybe we could say it like that. No, we've always done it this way. And I think that line is like the killer of any kind of future shift towards finding a younger audience, because if you've always done it that way, that is like the very first number one reason to try something different if you want to do something different. And I think charities are quite risk averse by nature, because, the whole income, that kind of balance you have of getting the income in, not wanting to scare off people who are already giving, but you do want to attract new people. Yeah, that does take a lot more thinking and diversification of your audience, but actually using the personas and thinking about what are the personas that we want to attract, not what are the personas we already have. And I think that's what ends up happening, is that people end up just going back to the safe space because that's where the money comes in. And actually you have to have a bit of vision, be a bit risky sometimes, get the personas of the people you want to attract. Where are those people? What platforms are they using? What are they talking about? How are they seeing social justice? And it is through more of a holistic lens, that it's not kind of this, I give and I've done kind of my bit and I can kind of get on with the rest of my life. Younger people now, a lot of them live and breathe this activism. So it's how do we actually think about engaging those people where they are and not worrying, that people who are giving are not going to stop giving. That's always kind of my thing, and that's kind of what I kind of rest on. But actually the people who you want to attract won't give unless you start talking to them in a way that they understand.
And I think this is a massive trick that a lot of British charities are missing, because even when you said a persona of an older person, I even had an image of a white old person, white British person in my mind, and that is the persona that lots of these charities are going for. But I don't ever see any of these charities talking about our parents. And if you think about first generation diaspora communities in the UK, they give to their own countries back home more than the entire aid budget. Like, these people give a lot of money. So if a lot of the charities started talking to them and maybe actually showing themselves as relevant to these communities, they would actually get a lot more money potentially. So it's just not just about political correctness or ticking a box or looking diverse. It could also transform the missions and the achievements of these organisations and what they're trying to do.
Sorry, because, I remember saying to someone I was working in Charities, they're like, we want to engage the black community because the black community gives so much. So you have to think, if I'm giving directly to you, why do I need you to give money? I don't. So it's about building that trust that would say, actually, if I can't give directly to you, actually, I would give it to you, because I think that if I give it to you, you'll be able to do something useful with it. But the recurring theme that I see in terms of, it's the imagery, it's the websites, it's the social media, it's, you know, the places they go, and you can't just go to communities with your hand out like, why don't you give us the money instead? It doesn't work like that, because where's the trust? Where's the relationship? And then if I go and have a look at your website, if I look at the materials you sent me through the post, all I'm seeing is poor black people being helped and white people helping them. And that level of saviorism in the imagery that is just so, you know, here we've got this cute little child helping this, you know, old African person, helping this old Indian, you know, you have to really think, if you send that to me, where do I fit in that image? Where do I fit in that story? Because you're not really showing images of people like me helping people who also look like me. And so I think there's a problematic disconnect there, that people don't understand why they can't connect with these communities. And again, it comes down to, if there's no one in your comms team looking at this and being like, actually, if I look on the feed and if I scroll down for the past 6 months, I can see that the only black faces on there are the poor in Africa, or the poor in India, or the poor wherever else.
The beneficiaries.
Gone, the beneficiaries. Then how does a black person here, who actually does have the money to give and support, where do you see them in that picture? And then the fact that then they can go to your website and see, and there's no one in your team that looks like this, or there's no one in your senior leadership team who looks like this. Don't tell me about your black intern. I'm really not interested. You know, I know we do need interning. However, show me your senior team, show me your leadership team, and show it me over time. And if I can see over time that your commitment really is only as helping black people, and never actually seeing them as equal, also created in the image of God like you, then that says to me, you have a problem with race. Let's not call it unconscious bias. Let's talk about the biases that people hold, because at this point it's quite conscious that you don't have that reflected in your teams.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen with that white saviorism stuff, the best response to that, or the best engagement with that I've seen is Médecins Sans Frontières, who did a video in the last year where they basically called out the times where they themselves have been guilty of white saviorism, doctoring photos to make it feel a bit more emotionally engaging. And that was a massive risk for them, because, you know, it could have ended them, actually. It could have been, you know, a crisis saying this organization have been manipulating things for the last, you know, number of decades. But the response has been super positive, because they've just owned it, which is what you're saying is let's have an honest conversation with where we're at. It's not that people are going to stop supporting you. Well, maybe some do, but that's a cost worth taking. But I think that there is a sense of needing the charity sector needing to do something about this, and needing. But I think there is also a sense of, I don't know. I feel like people are almost being too sensitive about it, in the sense that they're almost paralyzed by what to do because they don't want to do the wrong thing. How practically do you think charities can be engaging with us practically in a way that actually brings some meaningful outputs?
I think part of the paralysis is because people think they've got to change their biggest communications campaign. Actually, I think there's a lot of like testing and learning in this sector that can try and help to change the perceptions of the teams themselves. So we might think, well, we can't, we have to show brown people in poverty because otherwise people won't give us money. Well, why don't we test it and see what happens when we change that up a bit? Because we kind of fall into the trap of just kind of making assumptions that aren't based in reality. I would say, though, that there is an aid tracker that is done in, I think it's the University of Birmingham, which talks about perceptions among the UK public of kind of aid sector, imagery, all of those things. And one of the things that does play out is that the UK public, they want to see brown people in poverty because it makes them feel good when they help, and they do give a lot of money. But then you ask, well, what has led them to that? It's been decades and decades of the aid sector putting forward particular images. So if the aid sector just kind of keeps on churning that stuff out and feeding that, then obviously perceptions aren't going to change. So how can we start to take some risks, try and creatively change perceptions, do what MSF did, do what others have done, including No White Saviours, which is run by black women in African countries within this sector. We can be a bit cleverer than that. Like we're communicators, we're creative, we can think about the ways that we can both make people feel like they want to give while not playing into kind of lazy stereotypes or what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls a single story, this one story about reality.
Yeah, great. Genelle, when I speak to those who are black members of our team, there's a lot of unsaid stuff. There's a lot of stuff that there's a kind of smile that comes on their face, and they say, "Yeah, well, we're just used to this," or if there's kind of stereotypes that have happened that they're almost tired of, but don't necessarily speak up into it. How can organizations help raise the voices of so that we're able to challenge some of the preconceptions and some of the stereotypes and some of the maybe just some of the blind spots? How can organizations help give voice to those folks?
I think care more about truth. I think the interesting thing I found going from a newsroom to a charity, if a journalist in the newsroom, let's say management, decides to just, do whatever they're doing, the union will kick in, everyone will kick in, this isn't right, this is terrible. There's a lot of kind of justice and a sense of justice. And I found when I came to the charity sector, that wasn't there. There wasn't this sense of, we should all be kicking off about this because this is terrible. It was let's all be nice and let's just say things in a nice voice, because when you say things in a nice voice, you are nice. And I think there's kind of a thing about niceness which actually isn't nice, because it benefits only a very few people who know how to talk with a syrupy voice. And then you get the people who are suffering and actually can't speak up, because whenever they speak, don't get angry, don't be aggressive, all of those things. So actually it can be hard for people to speak up, because then you become a troublemaker, someone who's never satisfied. And, what do people want? And we're trying the best. I treat everyone the same. I'm nice to black people. Why would you say something like that unless you didn't think people are equal? And I think it's about a lot of self-awareness and self-examination. The paralysis comes because actually I think some people don't want to do what it's going to take to change. And actually sometimes it's easier to bury your head in the sand, because actually it feels like a lot of hard work for you to kind of reimagine what a fair space looks like for everybody. And actually, if it's serving you very well, you're not experiencing it as a problem, what really is your will to change? We just don't know what to do. And I remember someone saying this to me, and I said, well, listen, other things that you've wanted to learn to do, you've done them. You found out how to do them. You didn't know how to put a conference on, but you found out though, and you managed to do it. This is no different. You can find out, you can manage to do it. We can care about the experiences of other people. I think we all know what good treatment is. Everybody knows how they treat a VIP in their life, in their workspace. So you yourself must know when you are not giving someone that same treatment for whatever reason that you're doing it. And I think we need to become more concerned about truth and goodness rather than niceness, because that will allow us to have some really honest conversations. But for niceness, lots of things go unsaid, lots of behaviour goes unchecked, and the instinctual reaction when someone is like you is to defend them. So think about when someone has come to you and said about someone in your, I feel a bit of a vibe from them, feels a bit like they treat me differently because I'm black. And you mean, no, they're lovely. They've always been really good to me. And it's about stopping ourselves in our tracks, not just defending things and people because we like them, but really beginning to listen to people's honesty about what they're experiencing in the workplace, and allowing ourselves to be open to making change, and not just immediately becoming defensive and defending when actually someone is actually being really vulnerable in this moment and saying, I'm experiencing a problem here.
Yeah. I remember two friends of ours from Nigeria. They had an experience where people were getting out the swimming pool that they were using when they went in. And you could have said that's just a coincidence that person gets out of the swimming pool, but then it happened again, and then it happened again. And it's important that we don't just write these things off as coincidences or whatever it might be, but actually there is an underlying problem here. And
sorry, if I could just add, some of these organisations have had lots of black staff, actually. No, they haven't had black staff. If you have a revolving door of diverse talent, you need to inquire as to why. The scenarios, the teams they're in, what is going on, because it's not kind of good enough to be like, no one wants to work here. I know loads of black people who've worked at charities in across, all sectors, and they don't stay. And it is about that self-examination of why aren't they staying, having proper exit interviews, really properly taking to task team leaders who no person of colour seems to be able to work in their team, or they consistently don't hire any people of colour in their team. That's where you have to actually really begin to triage and tackle some of these things, or else nothing will ever change. It's not about being nice people, it's about justice.
Yeah. Chine, just cast a vision for those who are maybe, they really want to do this well. This is, I'm sure, been helpful for them in terms of doing it practically. What outcomes can people expect, or organisations expect, if they really engage with this and engage with it well?
I think if we talk about the kind of diversity of the teams themselves, say communications teams, I think, like Genelle said, it's not... Part of what puts people off is because it's hard and it's effort to do these things. So sometimes when we're going out to recruit, we didn't get any... We all got all white applicants, so it's going to have to be a white person. You could just go again, and you could go to different places. You could hold off on recruitment. You could try really hard, at least a couple of times, to just try and find those persons if you really feel that it's important, rather than just a tick box. So there's the kind of the recruitment side. There is the getting input as to why it is that people might not want to apply. What are the barriers? Kind of doing some work around that. I think I'd say that I previously worked for Christian Aid, and now I'm on the board there. And actually Christian Aid over the past few years no longer has a black woman CEO, but has a white man CEO. But over those years of doing some really hard work on kind of race and diversity, it's made some really inconvenient decisions, right? that just aren't easy, including recruiting people to the leadership team who are based in Nigeria or who are based elsewhere. It means they're not easily able to get to London. And so you've got to change your whole way of operating because you really believe that diversity is important. So I think being tenacious, like being really understanding why it is that diversity is good and important, not giving up at the first hurdle. But I'd also recommend a book called What White People Can Do Next by Emma Dabiri, which is a very short book. But one of the things that she talks about is one of the reasons why we're even still having this conversation is because we haven't told a compelling enough story about why diversity is important. It's not just about being woke or whatever. Diverse teams are the best teams. And actually, diversity is good for all of us. Or black people not getting shot in the street is good for all of us. Having diverse teams is good for all of us. It's not just about us kind of giving up power, white people giving up power to create space for black people. It's much more deep and much more important than that.
That's great. Just to finish, in terms of, you've mentioned a book there, but in terms of books or other resources that those who are watching or listening to this could engage with, is there any other things that you would recommend they read or download or whatever?
Well, I've written a book, Communicate to Change. They can have a read of that. But I think, the number one thing I think that will change most people's view of diversity is building better relationships with people who aren't like you. And I think there's no substitute for your own lived experience and enriching that. When I think of the enrichment difference has made in my life of meeting people who were nothing like me, and you actually realise there's loads of things you don't have in common, but there are loads of things that you do.
Right.
And so one of the things I would always recommend to people is diversify your circle. Don't just let people of different races and ethnicities and genders be people that you meet at work for 8 hours a day and talk about work. Let them be people in your life to enrich your life, to learn, to understand them, for them to understand you. And I think if more of us had diverse, rich groups of friendship circles of trust as well, I think this world would be transformed more quickly.
That's great. Well, thank you both so much for your time. This has been a really encouraging and pragmatic conversation that I think most of those who are watching this, we all need to be wrestling with these things and making sure that we're heading in the right direction. So thank you for your time and thank you for your input.